Every parent's worst nightmare had come true in the burning Arizona desert. A 7-year-old girl named Charlotte sat tied to a withered tree, abandoned by the wagon train that had promised her family safe passage west after her parents died. A fever. For 3 days, she had called out for help under the merciless sun, her small voice growing weaker with each passing hour. The desert heat was killing her slowly, and the vultures had already begun to circle overhead. Then, like a ghost from another world, a lone Apache warrior appeared through the shimmering heat waves. His name was Otaktay, and he had been tracking the wagon train for reasons of his own. When he saw the child's desperate situation, something stirred in his heart that he thought had died long ago. This meeting between two lost souls would change everything. But what had driven this warrior so far from his people, and what enemies would come hunting for them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather bonds fell away like dead snakes as Otaktay's knife sliced through them with practiced precision. Charlotte's wrists were raw and bleeding, marked with deep grooves where the rawhide had cut into her tender flesh during her desperate struggles. She should have been terrified of this tall, bronze-skinned stranger with the weathered face and long black hair adorned with feathers, but exhaustion and relief had numbed her capacity for fear. Otaktay moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned that survival depended on wasted motion, meaning death. He pulled a gourd water vessel from his belt and held it to Charlotte's cracked lips, watching as she drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and soaking into her torn calico dress. Her blue eyes, startling against her sun-burned face, looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Slow," he said in accented English, his voice gravelly from years of speaking mostly in his native tongue. "Too much makes sick." Charlotte nodded weakly and forced herself to sip instead of gulp. The water was warm, but tasted like salvation itself. As feeling returned to her limbs, she began to sob, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief that someone had finally come. For 3 days, she had believed she would die alone in this terrible place, forgotten by the world. Otaktay studied her with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience no man should possess. He had seen many children die, too many, and this one bore the particular pallor of someone teetering on the edge between life and death. Her small frame was dehydrated, her lips split and bleeding, her dress torn by thorns and stained with blood from dozens of small cuts. Yet something in her eyes spoke of a strength that reminded him painfully of another little girl, one who had died screaming in his arms 5 winters ago. He pushed that memory aside with the practiced discipline of a warrior. The past was finished, but this child still breathed. "What is your name? What is your—" he asked, kneeling beside the mesquite tree where she had been bound. "Charlotte," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Charlotte Davies. Are you going to hurt me?" Otaktay shook his head slowly. "I am Otaktay. It means kills many in my language, but you I will not harm. Can you stand?" Charlotte tried to rise, but her legs buckled. 3 days of being tied upright had stolen her strength, and dehydration had left her muscles weak as water. Otaktay caught her gently and lifted her with surprising tenderness for a man whose hands bore the calluses of countless battles. As he cradled her against his chest, Charlotte's fingers found the small silver locket hanging from a thin chain around her neck, the only thing of value the wagon train had not taken from her. Inside were tiny photographs of her parents, Thomas and Margaret Davies, taken just before they had left their small farm in Missouri to seek a better life in California. Now they lay buried in unmarked graves somewhere along the trail, victims of the fever that had swept through the wagon train like a plague. "My mama and papa," she whispered, opening the locket to show him the faded images. "They got sick and died. The wagon master said he would take care of me, but then they left." Me here. Otaktay's jaw tightened as he looked at the photographs. He had seen this story too many times. White settlers who promised protection only to abandon the vulnerable when caring became inconvenient. But there was something else in the child's story that troubled him, something that didn't ring true. Wagon masters were practical men who knew that abandoning a child in Apache territory would bring down the wrath of both the army and any tribes who discovered such cruelty. "What was the wagon master's name?" he asked. "Mr. Blackwood, Jeremiah." "Blackwood. He said my parents owed him money for the passage, and when they died I would have to work it off. But then the soldiers came and talked to him, and after that he said I was too much trouble." Soldiers. Otaktay's blood grew cold. In all his years of warfare against the white man's army, he had learned to recognize the patterns of corruption and cruelty that festered in the ranks. If soldiers had been involved in abandoning this child, there was more to this story than simple greed or inconvenience. He looked around the desolate landscape, taking in every detail with the trained eye of a scout. The mesquite tree stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by towering saguaro cacti and scattered patches of prickly pear. The ground showed signs of many horses, more than a simple wagon train would have. Boot prints from cavalry horses, mixed with the broader tracks of oxen and the narrow wheels of prairie schooners. But there were other signs too, areas where the sand had been deliberately swept to hide tracks, and the faint but unmistakable smell of gunpowder lingering in the still air. This had been a meeting place, not simply a spot chosen at random to abandon an inconvenient child. Otaktay's own story had begun 37 winters ago in the mountain strongholds of the Chiricahua Apache, where he had been born to parents who named him for the warrior's path they saw in his future. He had earned his adult name early, leading raids against Mexican settlements and later against the encroaching Americans who built their forts and towns on land his people had roamed. For generations, for 20 years, he had been a war chief, leading his band in the endless fight to preserve their way of life. He had been respected, feared, and successful in battle, but success in war had cost him everything that made victory worthwhile. His wife Desba, whose name meant going to war, had been killed in a cavalry attack on their winter camp. Their daughter, little Ayana, had died in his arms from wounds inflicted by soldiers who showed no mercy to women and children. After that, something had broken inside him. Not his courage or his skill. Those remained as sharp as ever, but his heart had turned to stone, and his purpose had narrowed to a single burning desire: to make the white soldiers pay for what they had taken from him. For 3 years, he had pursued that goal with methodical precision, tracking and eliminating the men responsible for the massacre of his family. One by one, he had found them and sent them to whatever gods they worshipped. But revenge, he had discovered, was like drinking salt water. It never quenched the thirst, only made it worse. 6 months ago, he had been tracking a cavalry patrol through this same desert when he discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in a rocky outcropping, he had found the remains of an Apache family, an old man, a woman, and 2 children, who had been tortured and killed not in battle, but in cold blood. Carved into the rock above their bodies was a message in English: "This is what happens to Apache who hide gold. Gold, the yellow metal that drove white men to madness and made them capable of any atrocity." Otaktay had heard rumors of a vast treasure hidden somewhere in Apache territory, a hoard of Spanish gold accumulated over centuries by his ancestors. Most of his people dismissed such stories as white man's fantasies, but the murdered family suggested that someone believed the legends strongly enough to kill for them. Since that discovery, Otaktay had been following a different kind of trail. Not the obvious tracks of army patrols, but the subtle signs left by men who moved in secret and killed to protect their secrets. That trail had led him to this place, where wagon trains met with cavalry units for purposes that had nothing to do with official army business. Now, holding this fragile white child in his arms, he sensed that their two stories were about to become one. Charlotte had fallen asleep against his chest, her small body finally relaxing as her exhausted mind accepted that she was safe. Otaktay rose carefully, cradling her like the daughter he had lost, and began walking toward a rocky outcropping he had spotted earlier. They would need shelter from the afternoon sun, and he needed time to think about what to do with this unexpected responsibility. As he walked, he found himself remembering Ayana's laugh, the way she would run to greet him when he returned from hunting, the songs she would sing while helping her mother prepare meals. Charlotte was perhaps a year younger than Ayana had been when she died, but there was something in her spirit that echoed his lost daughter's courage. The cave he had marked earlier proved to be perfect, deep enough to provide shade, with a narrow entrance that could be easily defended, and a small seep of water trickling from the rock at the back. Otaktay laid Charlotte gently on a bed of dried grass he quickly gathered, then began the process of making her more comfortable. From his medicine bag, he extracted healing herbs that he mixed with water to create a paste for her wounded wrists. As he worked, Charlotte stirred and opened her eyes, watching him with curiosity rather than fear. "Are you a medicine man?" she asked. "I am many things," he replied, wrapping her wrists with soft strips of leather. "Warrior, hunter, tracker, also healer when healing is needed. My mama was a healer too. She helped people who got sick on our farm. Papa said she had the gift." Charlotte's voice grew wistful. "She used to make tea from special plants when I couldn't sleep." Otaktay nodded gravely. "Your mother was wise. The earth provides medicine for those who know how to find it." As the afternoon wore on, Charlotte gradually felt strong enough to sit up and drink more water. Otaktay shared some jerky and pine nuts from his supplies, watching as color slowly returned to her pale cheeks. She was a resilient child, he realized, the kind who would survive hardships that would break adults. "Otaktay," she said carefully, trying to pronounce his name correctly. "Why did you help me? The wagon master said Indians, Apache, would scalp me if they found me." "Some would," he admitted honestly. "My people and your people have been at war for many years. Much blood has been spilled on both sides. But you are a child, and you are innocent of any crime. Only cowards make war on children. So you're not going to scalp me?" Despite himself, Otaktay almost smiled. "No, I will not scalp you." "Good," Charlotte said with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a 7-year-old. "I don't think I would like that very much." As evening approached and the desert began to cool, Otaktay found himself facing a decision he had not anticipated. He could not simply abandon this child as the wagon train had done. That would make him no better than the men he despised. But keeping her with him would complicate his mission and put both of them in danger. Yet as he watched Charlotte curl up on her grass bed, clutching her locket and whispering what sounded like a prayer for her dead parents, he realized the decision had already been made. Somewhere in the past few hours, this lost white child had become his responsibility, just as surely as if she had been born to his own people. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers and difficult choices. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Otaktay would sleep knowing that his actions had preserved a life rather than taken one. The warrior who killed many had become, at least for now, the guardian of one small, brave girl who had survived. The unthinkable, and somehow found the strength to trust again. The fever came that night, racking Charlotte's small body with chills, despite the desert's lingering heat. Otaktay had seen this before, the delayed reaction of a body pushed beyond its limits, finally allowing itself to feel the full impact of trauma once safety arrived. He bathed her burning forehead with cool water from the seep and spoke softly to her in Apache, words of comfort his own mother had used when he was small and frightened. In her delirium, Charlotte began to speak, her voice sometimes clear and sometimes rambling, as the fever carried her mind between present and past. Otaktay listened carefully, his warrior's instincts recognizing the difference between meaningless fever talk and the unburdening of terrible secrets. "Papa said we had to hide it," she mumbled, her fingers clutching at her locket. "He said the bedmen would come if they knew, but Mama got so sick, and Papa couldn't think straight. He drew the picture before he died, said I had to keep it safe." Otaktay leaned closer, his attention sharpening. "What picture, little one?" "In the locket," Charlotte whispered, her eyes still closed. "Papa put it behind Mama's picture. Said it was more important than all the gold in California. Said it would save his people if anything happened to him." With gentle fingers, Otaktay opened the silver locket that hung around Charlotte's neck. The photographs of her parents were clearly visible in the two oval frames. But as he examined the piece more closely, he noticed that one side seemed thicker than the other. His fingernail found a tiny catch, and a hidden compartment opened to reveal a folded piece of paper no larger than a playing card. The paper was covered with careful pencil markings, a hand-drawn map showing mountain peaks, river bends, and distinctive rock formations. At the center was a detailed drawing of a hidden canyon marked with symbols that made Otaktay's blood run cold. They were Apache symbols, sacred markings that few white men would recognize, indicating a place of deep spiritual significance to his people. But what sent ice through his veins was the notation written in English at the bottom of the map. "Sacred burial ground, 40 families, 200 years of treasure." This was what the murdered Apache family had died trying to protect. This was why soldiers had met with wagon trains in secret. And this was why little Charlotte Davies had been abandoned to die in the desert. Not from callousness, but from calculated murder disguised as abandonment. Otaktay's hands trembled as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Charlotte's father had not been a simple farmer seeking a new life in California. He had been involved in something far more dangerous, something that connected him to the systematic desecration of Apache sacred sites and the murder of innocent families. As if sensing his turmoil, Charlotte stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment they were clear and focused. "You found Papa's map," she said quietly. "Yes," Otaktay replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Can you tell me about it?" Charlotte struggled to sit up, and Otaktay helped her lean against the cave wall. Despite her fever, she seemed determined to speak clearly. "Papa wasn't really a farmer," she began, her small voice carrying a weight of knowledge no child should possess. "He bought and sold things, guns and ammunition and supplies. He said it was business, but sometimes the business made Mama cry when she thought I wasn't looking." Otaktay waited patiently as Charlotte gathered her strength to continue. "One day, some soldiers came to our farm. They had a man with them, an Indian man who was hurt real bad. The soldiers said he was a scout who had been helping them, but Papa could tell they were lying. The Indian man was dying, and before he died, he told Papa about a place where his people buried their chiefs and warriors. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Otaktay could picture the scene. A captured Apache, tortured for information, probably someone who had believed the soldiers' promises of fair treatment, only to discover too late that they served no flag but greed. "The dying man drew Papa a map," Charlotte continued. "He said his people had been putting gold and silver in the burial place for many, many years, whenever they traded with the Spanish and Mexicans. He said if Papa promised to keep the soldiers away from the sacred place, he would tell him where it was. And your father agreed." Charlotte nodded sadly. "Papa thought he could outsmart the soldiers. He thought he could get the treasure and use it to start a new life somewhere far away. But the soldiers were smarter than Papa thought. They followed us when we left Missouri, and they watched everything we did." The fever had given way to a terrible clarity, and Charlotte's eyes now held knowledge that should have taken decades to acquire. She had seen too much, understood too much, and survived too much for any 7-year-old. "Captain Morrison was the worst of them," she whispered. He would come to Papa late at night and threaten to hurt Mama and me if Papa didn't do what he wanted. Papa tried to protect us by agreeing to lead them to the treasure, but when Mama and Papa got sick with fever, everything went wrong. Morrison. Otaktay filed the name away with the cold precision of a hunter marking his prey. He had heard that name before, spoken in whispers around Apache campfires when warriors returned from scouting missions. Captain Jeremiah Morrison of the 7th Cavalry, a man known for his brutality toward Apache prisoners and his habit of operating far from the oversight of his superiors. Papa knew he was dying, Charlotte continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. Before the fever took him completely, he hid the real map in my locket and gave the soldiers a fake one. He told me that if anything happened to him and Mama, I should try to get to California and find his brother. But the soldiers figured out Papa had tricked them. They killed your parents, Otaktay said quietly. It was not a question. Charlotte nodded miserably. They put something in their medicine, made it look like the fever got worse. But I saw Captain Morrison leave their wagon late one night, and after that they died real quick. The wagon master, Mr. Blackwood, he was scared of the soldiers, so he did what they told him. And they left you to die because they thought you knew where the real map was. Captain Morrison said I was old enough to remember things Papa might have told me. He said leaving me for the Apache was more merciful than what he would do to me. If he had to get the information himself, the calculated cruelty of it made Otaktay's warrior blood sing for vengeance. These men had not just murdered 2 innocent people. They had orphaned a child and condemned her to die slowly in the desert, all for the sake of gold they had no right to claim. But there was something else, something that cut even deeper than rage. The sacred burial ground marked on Charlotte's map was the final resting place of Otaktay's own ancestors, including his grandparents and great-grandparents who had shaped him into the warrior he had become. The canyon was not just a repository of accumulated wealth, it was the spiritual heart of his people's connection to this land. For over 2 centuries, Apache families had brought their most precious possessions to that canyon when their loved ones passed into the spirit world. Spanish silver and gold, yes, but also family heirlooms, sacred objects, and ceremonial items that could never be replaced. To disturb that place would be to sever the connection between the living Apache and all those who had gone before. Charlotte fell back into exhausted sleep. Otaktay sat in the cave entrance and stared out at the desert landscape, his mind working through the implications of what he had learned. Captain Morrison and his men were not just treasure hunters. They were engaged in a systematic campaign to locate and loot every Apache sacred site in the territory. The murdered family he had found 6 months ago had probably been killed for refusing to reveal similar locations. But now Morrison had what he needed to find the most important site of all. Even with Charlotte's father's deception, it would not take long for experienced scouts to use the fake map as a starting point and locate the real canyon through careful searching. Otaktay's personal war against the cavalry had suddenly become something much larger. He was no longer just seeking revenge for his own losses. He had become the last guardian of his people's most sacred place, and the protector of a child whose only crime was being born to parents who had made a terrible mistake. In the distance, he could hear the sound that had been haunting his dreams for months, the rhythmic drumming of cavalry horses moving through the desert. Morrison was still out there, still searching, still killing anyone who stood between him and his prize. Tomorrow, Otaktay would have to make the most difficult decision of his life. He could take Charlotte far from this place, try to find safety, for both of them, among the scattered Apache bands, still free in the mountains. Or he could honor his duty as a guardian of sacred places and find a way to stop Morrison, even if it meant putting Charlotte in greater danger. As he fingered the broken cavalry saber he carried as a reminder of his destroyed village, Otaktay realized that the choice had already been made. He had failed to protect his own daughter, but he would not fail to protect Charlotte. and he would not allow the spirits of his ancestors to be disturbed by men whose souls were as barren as the desert itself. The war that had taken everything from him was about to become the war that would define everything he had left to lose. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity that only the desert could provide, washing the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Otaktay of dried blood. Charlotte's fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She sat quietly as Otaktay prepared to leave the cave, watching him with the serious attention of a child who had learned that survival depended on understanding adult decisions. "We must go," he said simply, shouldering his medicine bag and checking his weapons. "The soldiers will come here soon." "How do you know?" Charlotte asked, rising unsteadily to her feet. Otaktay pointed to a distant ridge where a thin column of smoke rose into the morning air. "Signal fire. They found our trail from yesterday." He had been teaching her to read the desert signs without realizing it. The way disturbed rocks told stories of passage, how the flight patterns of birds revealed the presence of intruders, why certain plants grew differently in areas where water ran underground. Charlotte absorbed these lessons with the quick intelligence of a child whose life now depended on such knowledge. "Where will we go?" she asked, accepting the water gourd he offered her. "North, toward the mountains. But first, you must learn to walk like Apache, or we will not live to see another sunset." For the next hour, Otaktay taught Charlotte the basics of desert travel. How to step on rocks instead of sand to avoid leaving tracks, how to use natural cover to remain invisible against the landscape, how to conserve water and energy in the killing heat. Her small size proved to be an advantage. She could hide in spaces too small for adult pursuers and move with less disturbance than a grown person. "Why are you helping me?" Charlotte asked as they paused in the shade of a towering saguaro cactus. "Your people and my people are enemies." Otaktay considered the question carefully. In his language, there were different words for enemy. Those who opposed you in honorable battle, those who threatened your family, and those who acted without honor or courage. Charlotte's people fell into the second category, but Charlotte herself belonged to none of them. "You are not my enemy," he said finally. "You are a child far from home, like my daughter was when she died. The men who killed your parents, they are my enemies. The men who hunt us now, they are my enemies, but you are just a little girl who needs help. What was your daughter's name?" "Ayana. It means eternal blossom." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think she would have liked me." Something twisted in Otaktay's chest. Pain, but also a strange kind of healing. "Yes, I think she would have." They traveled through the hottest part of the day, following game trails and dry creek beds that provided natural cover. Otaktay found himself constantly amazed by Charlotte's resilience. She never complained about the heat or the difficulty of the terrain, never asked to rest when he judged it unsafe to stop. Instead, she listened to his instructions and followed them with the focused determination of someone who understood that mistakes could be fatal. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a series of rock formations that provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes. Otaktay called a halt, recognizing the signs of Charlotte's exhaustion despite her brave efforts to hide it. As she rested in the shade, he took out the map from her locket and studied it more carefully. The sacred canyon marked on the paper was perhaps 2 days' travel to the northeast, hidden in a maze of arroyos and mesas that would challenge even experienced cavalry. But the route Charlotte's father had drawn avoided several natural landmarks that would have made the journey easier, suggesting that even in his cooperation with the soldiers, he had been trying to make their task more difficult. "Is that where we're going?" Charlotte asked, looking over his shoulder at the map. "Eventually," Otaktay replied. "But first, we must make sure no one follows us there." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of horses reached their hiding place. Otaktay quickly folded the map and gestured for Charlotte to move deeper into the rocks. Through a gap in the stone, they watched as a cavalry patrol approached. 6 mounted soldiers in dusty blue uniforms, led by a young officer with lieutenant's bars on his collar. Lieutenant Hayes dismounted near their morning camp and examined the ground with the careful attention of an experienced tracker. Even from their distant hiding place, Otaktay could see the man's competence in the way he read the signs they had left behind. This was not the kind of soldier who would give up easily or make careless mistakes. "They went north," Hayes called to his men. "Indian and a child, moving fast but trying to hide their trail." "Could be any Indian with any kid," one of the soldiers replied. "How do we know it's the right ones?" Hayes held up something that caught the sunlight, a small piece of torn calico fabric. "This matches the description of the girl's dress. And look at these moccasin prints. They're Apache. But the stride is too long for a warrior carrying a child. He's making her walk." Otaktay felt a grudging respect for the young officer's tracking skills, even as he recognized the danger they represented. This man would not be easy to lose or mislead. "Mount up," Hayes ordered. "If we can catch them before they reach the high country, we can end this business today." As the patrol rode away to the north, following the false trail Otaktay had deliberately left for them, Charlotte emerged from her hiding place with wide eyes. "How did you know they would go the wrong way?" she whispered. "Apache learn from childhood to lay false trails," Otaktay explained. "Your tracks show what you want enemy to see, not always where you really go. Will you teach me?" The simple question struck Otaktay with unexpected force. She was asking him to share the deepest secrets of Apache survival, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of warriors and hunters. To teach such things to a white child would have been unthinkable just days ago, but looking at Charlotte's earnest face, dirty and sunburned but bright with intelligence and determination, Otaktay found himself nodding. "Yes," he said, "if we are to survive together, you must learn to think like Apache." For the rest of the afternoon, as they continued their careful journey toward the mountains, Otaktay began Charlotte's education in the ways of his people. He showed her how to identify different types of tracks, how to use the position of the sun and stars for navigation, how to find water in seemingly barren landscape. She learned the Apache words for common desert plants and animals and began to understand the complex relationship between his people and the land they called home. "In your language," Otaktay explained as they paused beside a hidden spring, "you say you own land. You buy it, you sell it, you fence it. In Apache way, land owns you. You belong to place where you are born, and it belongs to you, but neither can exist without the other." Charlotte absorbed this with the serious attention she gave to all his teachings. "Is that why the sacred place is so important? Because your people belong to it?" "Yes, and because our ancestors rest there, watching over us. If that place is disturbed, the connection between living Apache and spirit world is broken. We become like tumbleweeds, blown by every wind with no roots to hold us." As evening approached and they made camp in a sheltered canyon, Otaktay realized that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. Charlotte was no longer just a burden he had accepted out of duty. She was becoming a student, a companion, and in some ways the daughter he had lost. But with that realization came a deeper understanding of the stakes involved. If they were caught, Captain Morrison would not simply kill them. He would torture them for information about the map, and Charlotte's age would not protect her from his cruelty. The only way to keep her safe was to reach the sacred canyon first and find a way to stop Morrison permanently. Tomorrow, their real journey would begin. 3 days into their journey, Charlotte had begun calling Otaktay guardian in the Apache language, Nasha. The word came naturally to her lips, and Otaktay found that he did not correct it. There was something fitting about the title, something that acknowledged both his protective role and the spiritual dimension of their unlikely partnership. Their routine had settled into the careful rhythm of desert survival. They traveled in the cool hours before dawn and after sunset, resting during the brutal heat of midday in whatever shade they could find. Charlotte's fair skin had darkened under the desert sun, and her soft city hands had grown calloused from climbing rocks and gathering firewood. More importantly, she had learned to move with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. On the fourth morning, that hard-won confidence was put to its first real test. They were crossing a broad valley dotted with organ-pipe cacti when Otaktay suddenly stopped and gestured for Charlotte to freeze. In the distance, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, 3 riders were approaching from the south. Even without being able to see their faces, Otaktay recognized the precise formation and steady pace of experienced cavalry. "Down," he whispered, and Charlotte immediately dropped flat against the sandy ground behind a cluster of barrel cacti. Lieutenant Hayes had proven to be more persistent and intelligent than Otaktay had hoped. Instead of following the false trail blindly, the young officer had apparently circled back to pick up their real track. Now, the gap between hunters and hunted had narrowed dangerously. Otaktay studied the approaching patrol through the growing light. Hayes rode in the center, flanked by 2 seasoned troopers whose relaxed posture suggested they had not yet spotted their quarry. They were following the track methodically, but without immediate urgency, still hunting rather than closing for the kill. "Stay here," Otaktay breathed into Charlotte's ear. "Do not move until I return. If soldiers find you and I am not here, tell them you are lost, that your family died and you have been wandering alone. Do not mention me." Charlotte's eyes went wide with fear, but she nodded understanding. In the past few days, she had learned to trust Otaktay's judgment completely, even when his decisions frightened her. Otaktay moved like a shadow, using every natural depression and rise in the ground to remain invisible as he worked his way toward the patrol. His war paint, sacred pigments he carried in small leather pouches, would have to wait for a more appropriate time, but the warrior's instincts were fully awakened now. The first trooper never knew what hit him. Otaktay rose from behind a boulder, like a vengeful spirit, his knife finding the gap between the man's ribs with surgical precision. The soldier slumped forward in his saddle, dead before he could cry out, but his horse shied and whinnied at the smell of blood. Lieutenant Hayes spun toward the sound, his hand moving to his sidearm with the quick reflexes of a combat veteran. But Otaktay was already in motion, launching himself from the rocks in a flying tackle that knocked both men from the saddle. They hit the ground hard, rolling and struggling in a desperate, silent battle. Hayes was younger and stronger than Otaktay, had expected, with the lean muscle and quick reflexes of a man who had survived multiple campaigns. His service revolver cleared its holster even as they grappled, but Otaktay managed to grab his wrist and force the weapon skyward just as it discharged. The gunshot cracked across the desert like thunder, and Otaktay knew their stealth was finished. But Hayes was not finished. He drove a knee toward Otaktay's ribs and twisted free of the Apache's grip, rolling away and bringing his weapon to bear. Time seemed to slow as Otaktay saw death looking at him down the barrel of the cavalry colt. But then a rock the size of a man's fist struck Hayes in the temple with enough force to stagger him. The shot went wide, and Otaktay was on him instantly, the fight ending with a wet sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Charlotte stood 20 feet away, her face pale but determined, her small hands still grimy with sand from the rock she had thrown. She had violated his direct order to stay hidden, but her courage had saved both their lives. "The third soldier?" Otaktay asked, rising and scanning the area. "Ran away," Charlotte said quietly. "When the gun went off, his horse spooked and carried him back the way they came." Otaktay nodded grimly. The fleeing trooper would report back to Captain Morrison within hours, which meant their pursuers would know exactly where to find them. But there was something else. In Hayes' saddlebags, Otaktay found official military documents that made his blood run cold. The papers revealed that Morrison's operation was far larger than he had imagined. Maps of the entire territory were marked, with Apache burial sites, water sources, and winter camps. A ledger listed the locations where archaeological specimens had been recovered, along with their estimated value in the eastern markets, where wealthy collectors paid premium prices. For Native American artifacts, "What is it?" Charlotte asked, seeing the expression on his face. "Your father was not the first," Otaktay said quietly. "Many people have died for this gold." Among the documents was a letter that made the scope of the conspiracy clear. It was signed by a territorial official in Tucson, authorizing expedited removal of hostile Apache elements from areas of historical and mineral significance. The language was careful and bureaucratic, but the meaning was unmistakable. Morrison had official sanction to kill any Apache who interfered with his treasure hunting. But it was the final document that struck Otaktay like a physical blow. It was a hand-drawn sketch of his own daughter, Ayanna, with a notation that read, "Child killed during resistance to lawful archaeological survey. Witness accounts suggest she may have known location of primary burial site." His hands shook as the truth hit him. Ayanna had not died in a random cavalry attack on their camp. She had been murdered specifically because Morrison's men believed she possessed knowledge about the sacred canyon. His daughter had been tortured for information she did not have, killed by men who saw Apache children as obstacles to be eliminated rather than human beings deserving of protection. "Nasha," Charlotte's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Otaktay forced himself to focus on the present, pushing down the rage that threatened to overwhelm his judgment. There would be time for grief and vengeance later, but Charlotte's safety had to come first. "We must move," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Take what water and food you can carry. Leave everything else." As they gathered supplies from the dead soldiers' packs, Charlotte studied Otaktay's face with the intuitive understanding that came from sharing life-and-death situations. "The papers told you something bad," she said. "It was not a question. Yes, very bad. About your daughter." Otaktay looked at her in surprise. He had never specifically mentioned how Ayanna died, only that she was gone. "You talk in your sleep." "Sometimes," Charlotte explained. "You say her name and you sound so sad. And just now, when you looked at those papers, you had the same expression my papa had when the soldiers came to our farm." The child's perceptiveness was both impressive and disturbing. She was learning to read adult emotions with an accuracy that suggested she had been forced to develop survival skills far beyond her years. "The men who hunt us killed my daughter," Otaktay said simply. "They thought she knew secrets she did not know. Now they want to kill us for the same reason." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry about Ayanna. She was lucky to have you for a father." The unexpected kindness nearly broke through Otaktay's carefully maintained composure. This white child, who had every reason to fear and distrust him, was offering comfort for a loss that most of her people would have considered justified. "Come," he said roughly. "We have far to go before dark." They climbed into the high country as the morning heat built toward its daily crescendo. The terrain grew more rugged with each mile, offering better concealment but also more opportunities for ambush. Otaktay found himself constantly scanning the ridgelines for the glint of sunlight on metal that would warn of hidden riflemen. By midday, they had reached a series of interconnected canyons that Otaktay remembered from his youth. His grandfather had brought him here to hunt deer and to learn the stories that connected Apache people to specific landmarks. Now those same stories might provide the key to keeping Charlotte alive. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow gap between two towering rock walls. "We rest there." The canyon proved to be everything Otaktay had hoped: cool, defensible, with multiple escape routes and a reliable water source. More importantly, it was a place of power for his people, where the spirits of ancient warriors were said to watch over those who honored the old ways. As Charlotte rested in the shade, Otaktay performed a ritual he had not attempted since Ayanna's death. From his medicine bag, he took the sacred war paint pigments. red ochre for courage, white clay for spiritual protection, and charcoal for the unseen world of spirits. With careful strokes, he painted traditional symbols on his face and hands, asking his ancestors for strength and wisdom. Charlotte watched the ceremony with respectful silence, somehow understanding that she was witnessing something sacred. When Otaktay finished, she asked, "Are you getting ready to fight?" "Yes, but not the kind of fighting you have seen before." "What kind, then?" Otaktay studied her serious face, this child who had seen her parents murdered and had somehow found the courage to throw rocks at armed cavalry soldiers. She deserved an honest answer. "The kind of fighting where warriors become legends," he said. "The kind where a man discovers whether his spirit is strong enough to protect what matters most." Charlotte nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "My mama used to say that sometimes people have to do hard things because doing easy things won't save the people they love." Your mother was wise. "Will you save me, Nasha?" The question was asked without drama or desperation, just the matter-of-fact trust of a child who had learned to rely on the adult who had proven worthy of her confidence. "Yes," Otaktay said, and felt the weight of that promise settle into his bones like war paint soaking into skin. "I will save you, and I will make sure. The men who killed your parents and my daughter never hurt another child." As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, distant smoke signals appeared on the horizon. Morrison's men were coordinating a systematic search of the entire area. The hunt was intensifying, and soon there would be nowhere left to run. But Otaktay was no longer running. He was moving toward his destiny, carrying with him a 7-year-old girl who had somehow become the most important thing in a world that had taken everything else away. The abandoned trading post squatted against the desert landscape like a broken tooth, its adobe walls cracked and weathered by years of neglect. Charlotte recognized it immediately from her father's stories. Davies Trading Company, established 1863. The sign read, though the paint had faded until the letters were barely visible. This was where her family's journey west had truly begun, and where the seeds of their destruction had been planted. Otaktay approached the structure with the cautious precision of a wolf entering unfamiliar territory. Something about the place felt wrong, too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. The door hung open on rusted hinges, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. "Papa used to own this place," Charlotte said quietly, as they crept closer. "Before we moved to the farm in Missouri, he said he sold it to pay for our wagon and supplies." But as they entered the main room, it became clear that Thomas Davies had left more behind than just a business. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, Otaktay discovered a metal strongbox that contained documents Charlotte had never seen before. The trading post token, a stamped metal disc bearing her father's business insignia, lay on top of a stack of papers that told a story very different from the one Charlotte remembered. Her father had not been a simple merchant selling supplies to travelers. The documents revealed a complex web of arms dealing that stretched from Missouri to Mexico, with Thomas Davies serving as a middleman between corrupt cavalry officers and Apache bands who needed weapons to defend themselves. But the business had grown darker over time, evolving from survival-based trading into something far more sinister. "Your father sold guns to my people," Otaktay said, studying an invoice dated just months before the Davies family left Missouri. "But he also sold them to the soldiers who hunted us." Charlotte's hands trembled as she looked through the papers. Letters from Captain Morrison detailed payments for specialized Apache intelligence, while correspondence with various Apache war chiefs showed her father providing weapons in exchange for information about tribal movements and sacred sites. "He was playing both sides," she whispered, the awful truth sinking in. "He was helping the soldiers find Apache camps and then selling guns to Apache who were trying to escape." A particular letter made Otaktay's jaw tighten with controlled rage. It was Morrison's handwriting, casual and confident. "Davies, your..." Information about the winter camp was excellent. 14 hostile Apaches eliminated, including several known war leaders. The archaeological specimens recovered will more than cover your commission. Looking forward to our next collaboration. 14 Apache killed in a winter camp. That had been Otaktay's own band, including his wife and daughter. Thomas Davies had provided the intelligence that led to their deaths, traded their lives for Morrison's gold. Charlotte read the letter over his shoulder, her face growing pale as the implications became clear. "Oh, Papa," she whispered. "What did you do?" "Your father helped kill my family," Otaktay said quietly. "He sold their lives for money." For a long moment, Charlotte stared at the evidence of her father's betrayal, her world crumbling around her like the trading post's crumbling walls. The man she had loved and trusted, whose memory had sustained her through days of torture and abandonment, had been responsible for the deaths of innocent people, including the daughter of the man who had saved her life. "I'm sorry," she said finally, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Nasha. I didn't know. I would never have if I had known." Otaktay watched her grief with a complex mixture of emotions. Part of him wanted to rage at this child for her father's crimes, to hold her accountable for blood that had been spilled before she was old enough to understand the concepts of right and wrong. But a larger part recognized the genuine anguish. In her tears, the way her entire sense of identity was being shattered by this revelation. "You were a child," he said at last. "Children do not choose their parents' sins." "But I have his blood," Charlotte sobbed. "I'm the daughter of a man who killed your family. How can you still protect me?" It was the question that cut to the heart of everything. Honor, justice, the cycle of vengeance that had consumed so many Apache lives. By every law of his people, Charlotte Davies was an enemy to be killed, or at least abandoned. Her father's betrayal had earned a blood debt that could only be repaid with blood. But looking at her tear-stained face, Otaktay saw not Thomas Davies' daughter, but the child who had thrown rocks at cavalry soldiers to save his life, who had learned Apache words with eager determination, who had called him guardian and meant it with the pure trust of innocence. "Your father chose his path," Otaktay said slowly. "You will choose yours. I have seen your heart, Charlotte Davies. It is not your father's heart." Outside, the sound of approaching horses cut short their emotional reckoning. Through the cracked window, Otaktay could see dust clouds rising in the distance, a large force moving fast toward the trading post. Morrison had tracked them here, drawn perhaps by the same logic that had brought them to search for answers about the past. "We must go," Otaktay said, quickly gathering the most important documents from the strongbox. "But now we go as equals. You know the truth about your father, and you must decide. Will you help me stop the men who killed both our families?" Charlotte wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders with a determination that reminded Otaktay powerfully of his own daughter's courage. "Yes," she said firmly. "Papa was wrong, but maybe I can help make it right." They slipped out the back of the trading post just as the first cavalry scouts appeared on the horizon. But the documents they carried now changed everything about their mission. Charlotte was no longer just an innocent victim to be protected. She was a partner in the fight against Morrison's conspiracy, armed with knowledge that could expose the corruption that had cost so many lives. As they climbed into the rocks behind the trading post, Charlotte asked, "Nasha, do you think Papa was always bad, or did he just make bad choices?" "I think your father was afraid," Otaktay replied. "Fear makes people do things they would not do if they were brave. But fear is not an excuse for choosing evil over good." "I'm afraid too," Charlotte admitted. "But I want to be brave like you." "You are already brave," Otaktay told her. "Brave? Enough to face the truth about your father. Brave enough to choose a different path. That is the hardest kind of courage." Behind them, they could hear Morrison's men searching the trading post, their voices carrying clearly in the desert air. The captain himself was among them, his cultured Eastern accent distinctive even at a distance. "Burn it," Morrison ordered. "If there was anything useful here, they've already found it." We'll track them into the high country and finish this business once and for all." Smoke began to rise from the trading post, carrying away the last physical traces of Thomas Davies's double life. But the knowledge they had gained would travel with them into the mountains, where the final confrontation between past and future, between honor and greed, would determine whether Charlotte Davies would grow up to become her father's daughter or something entirely new. The weight of her father's sins would always be with her, but Otaktay had given her something more valuable than innocence. He had given her the chance to choose redemption. The eagle feather had belonged to Otaktay's grandfather, passed down through 3 generations of Apache warriors who had carried it into battle as a symbol of the connection between earth and sky. Now, as he and Charlotte climbed higher into the sacred mountains, Otaktay felt the presence of his ancestors more strongly than he had since Ayana's death. The feather, tucked carefully into his medicine bag, seemed to pulse with its own spiritual energy. 3 days had passed since they fled the burning trading post, and Charlotte had changed in ways that went deeper than her sun-darkened skin and calloused hands. The revelation about her father's crimes had stripped away the last vestiges of childhood innocence, but in its place had grown something stronger, a clear-eyed determination to forge her own path, regardless of the sins she had inherited. "Tell me about the sky spirits," Charlotte said, as they paused to rest beside a mountain stream. "In the stories you've been teaching me." Otaktay smiled slightly. Her appetite for Apache lore had become insatiable, as if she were trying to fill the void left by her shattered illusions about her father with something more substantial and honest. "My grandfather taught that the eagle carries messages between the living and those who have passed into the spirit world," he explained, taking the sacred feather from his bag and holding it up to catch the mountain light. "When an Apache warrior dies honorably, his spirit rides the wind on eagle's wings, watching over his people from the place between earth and sky." "Do you think my papa's spirit watches over me?" Charlotte asked quietly. It was a question that had no easy answer. In Apache belief, the spirits of those who died dishonorably were trapped in the shadow world, unable to find peace until their wrongs were somehow set right. But Charlotte was not Apache, and her father's fate was not for Otaktay to judge. "I think," he said carefully, "that your father's spirit sees you now, trying to repair the damage he caused. Perhaps that gives him some peace." They were interrupted by the sound of voices drifting up from the valley below. Otaktay quickly concealed the feather and motioned for Charlotte to remain silent as they crept to the edge of the cliff to observe. Below them, a small group of Apache travelers had made camp near the stream, 2 adults and 3 children, leading pack horses loaded with their belongings. They were peaceful Apache, probably a family fleeing the increasing military pressure in the lower country. The sight of them made Otaktay's heart ache with longing for the life he had lost. "Are they your people?" Charlotte whispered. "Yes, but they do not know me. My band was scattered after my family died." The Apache family seemed to be resting comfortably, unaware that they were being watched from above. The children played in the stream while their parents prepared a simple meal, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls like music. It was a scene of perfect domestic tranquility, the kind of life Otaktay had once taken for granted. Then Charlotte stiffened beside him, pointing to movement on the far side of the valley. "Nasha, look!" A line of horsemen was approaching the Apache camp from the south, not cavalry, but Apache warriors in war paint and traditional dress. At their head rode a figure that made Otaktay's blood turn to ice in his veins. Chato. Once, Chato had been Otaktay's closest friend and battle companion, a warrior whose courage and skill had been legendary among their people. They had hunted together, fought together, shared the bonds that connected Apache men like brothers. But the years of warfare and loss had changed Chato, twisting his honor into something dark and bitter. "Who is that?" Charlotte asked, sensing the tension in Otaktay's body. "Someone I once called brother," Otaktay replied grimly. Now he believes that helping white people, even innocent ones, makes me a traitor to Apache ways. The confrontation below unfolded with terrible inevitability. Chatto's warriors surrounded the peaceful family's camp, weapons drawn but not yet raised in direct threat. Words were exchanged, too distant for Otaktay to hear clearly, but the body language told the story. Chatto was questioning the family about something, his tone growing more aggressive with each exchange. Suddenly, one of the Apache children pointed up toward the cliff where Otaktay and Charlotte were hidden. The boy had sharp eyes and had spotted movement in the rocks above. Chatto followed the child's gesture and locked eyes with Otaktay across the distance, his scarred face breaking into a predatory smile. "Come down, old friend," Chatto called, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "or I will assume you are too ashamed to face the people you have betrayed." Otaktay felt Charlotte tense beside him, ready to run, but he placed a restraining hand on her shoulder. Running now would only ensure that the innocent family below paid the price for his choices. "Stay behind the rocks," he told Charlotte quietly. "Do not show yourself no matter what happens." "Don't go down there," Charlotte pleaded. "It's a trap." "Yes, but sometimes walking into a trap is the only honorable thing to do." Otaktay rose from concealment and began the long climb down to the valley floor, his weapons visible but not drawn. Each step took him closer to a confrontation that had been inevitable since the day he chose to save a white child instead of pursuing his war against the cavalry. The peaceful Apache family watched with growing fear as Chatto's warriors formed, a circle around their leader and his former friend. The children clung to their parents, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that could end in blood. "Otaktay," Chatto said, as the two men faced each other in the center of the clearing. "You were once the finest warrior in our band. Now look at you, reduced to nursemaid for white children." "I see you have chosen different children to threaten," Otaktay replied, gesturing toward the cowering family. "These people have done no wrong to anyone. They have harbored a traitor," Chatto spat. "They gave you food and shelter, knowing you travel with the enemy." The truth hit Otaktay like a physical blow. The family had indeed helped them 2 nights earlier, sharing their fire and their food when Charlotte was weak from hunger and exhaustion. Their kindness had been repaid with Chatto's suspicion and hatred. "I forced nothing from them," Otaktay said. "They offered help freely, as Apache have always done for travelers in need." "Apache travelers, yes," Chatto agreed. "But you no longer travel as Apache. You have taken the white child as your own, chosen her life over the lives of our people. Every day she lives, more Apache die, because you will not give Morrison what he wants." From her hiding place in the rocks above, Charlotte watched the confrontation with growing horror. She could not understand all the Apache words being spoken, but the meaning was clear enough. Chatto intended to kill the innocent family because they had shown kindness to her and Otaktay. Without conscious thought, she began to climb down from her hiding place. If her presence was causing this violence, then she would face it directly, rather than let others die for her sake. "Stop," she called out in her careful Apache as she entered the clearing. "Don't hurt them, I'm here." Both warriors turned toward her in surprise. Chatto's expression shifted from anger to something like amazement as he took in the sight of a white child speaking his language, wearing clothes modified in Apache style, carrying herself with the quiet dignity she had learned from Otaktay. "So," Chatto said softly, "the white child comes to speak for herself. Tell me, little one, why should Apache warriors not kill you for the crimes of your people?" Charlotte stood straighter, drawing on every lesson in courage that Otaktay had taught her. "Because I am not my people," she said clearly. "I am Charlotte Davies, daughter of Otaktay, student of Apache ways. I choose to stand with honor, not with the men who killed his family and mine." The words hung in the mountain air like a challenge, and Otaktay felt his heart swell with pride, even as he feared for Charlotte's safety. She had chosen to face danger rather than hide from it, chosen to claim her place in Apache society rather than deny her connection to it. But Chato's response would determine whether her courage would be rewarded or punished with death. The sacred canyon opened before them like a gateway to another world, its towering red walls carved by centuries of wind and water into shapes that seemed almost deliberately crafted by divine hands. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone surfaces, spirals, and animal figures and symbols whose meanings had been passed down through generations of Apache storytellers. This was the place marked on Charlotte's map, the destination that had cost so many lives and driven so much betrayal. But as they descended into the canyon's depths, Charlotte began to understand that everything she had been told about this place was wrong. "Where is the gold?" she asked, looking around the peaceful valley floor where a clear stream meandered between groves of cottonwood trees. Papa's map said this was where the treasure was hidden. Otaktay smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since. They discovered her father's documents. "Your father was right. This is where the treasure is hidden." But he did not understand what kind of treasure it really was. The burial ground that had driven Morrison to murder was indeed the final resting place of Apache ancestors, but not in the way Charlotte had imagined. Instead of individual graves marked with mounds and headstones, the canyon contained something far more significant, a hidden valley where Apache families had lived and thrived for over 2 centuries, completely invisible from the outside world. Ancient dwellings were built into the canyon walls, their entrances concealed by natural rock formations and careful camouflage. Terrace gardens stretched along the stream, growing corn and beans and squash, using irrigation techniques perfected over generations. This was not a cemetery, but a sanctuary, a place where Apache people could live according to traditional ways, while remaining hidden from the encroaching white world. "The Spanish gold your father wrote about," Otaktay explained as they walked deeper into the valley, "came from trade with my ancestors over many years, but they did not hoard it like white. Men hoard money. They used it to build this place, to buy seeds and tools and materials that would help their children live good lives." Charlotte stared in wonder at the hidden community. Elderly Apache tended gardens, while children played in the stream, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. It was a scene of perfect peace, untouched by the violence and hatred that consumed the outside world. "How many people live here?" she asked. 43, at last count," Otaktay replied. "The last free Apache in this part of the territory. If Morrison finds this place, they will all be killed or forced onto reservations. Their way of life will disappear forever." The true treasure of the sacred canyon was not gold or silver, but something infinitely more valuable: the preservation of Apache culture and the safety of Apache children who could grow up learning traditional ways. Charlotte's father had drawn his map believing he was marking the location of Spanish treasure, never understanding that he was actually revealing the hiding place of an entire people. But their moment of peaceful revelation was shattered by the sound of gunfire echoing from the canyon entrance. Morrison had arrived with a force large enough to overwhelm any resistance, and he had brought civilian miners equipped with the tools needed to strip the canyon bare. "Captain Morrison!" The voice boomed through the valley with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "I know you're in there with the girl. Come out now, and I'll make your deaths quick. Keep hiding, and I'll take this place apart stone by stone until I find what I'm looking for." From their concealment among the ancient dwellings, Charlotte and Otaktay could see the cavalry force spreading out across the canyon mouth, at least 20 soldiers with repeating rifles, supported by a group of heavily armed miners. Morrison himself sat his horse in the center of the formation, his uniform immaculate despite the hard desert travel. But there was something else, something that made Otaktay's blood run cold with rage and betrayal. Riding beside Morrison was Chato, the Apache warrior who had been Otaktay's closest friend and battle companion, the man who had questioned Charlotte's right to live, was now openly collaborating with the soldiers who had murdered Apache families. "Chato!" Charlotte whispered, recognizing the scarred warrior from their earlier encounter. "But I thought he hated white soldiers." "Hatred can be turned to many purposes," Otaktay replied grimly. "Morrison has promised him something he wants. More than honor." As if hearing his thoughts, Morrison called out again, "Your Apache friend has been most helpful, Otaktay. He's told us all about this hidden valley, about the families living here in defiance of federal law. In exchange for his cooperation, I've agreed to let him personally kill you and the girl. He seems to think it will restore his standing among his people." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Chato had not just allied with Morrison. He had sold out the location of the hidden valley, condemning 43 innocent Apache to death or imprisonment for the sake of his personal vendetta against Otaktay. "There's something else," Charlotte said quietly, pointing to a document case Morrison carried. "Look at those papers." Otaktay followed her gaze and felt his world shift once again. The documents Morrison was holding were not maps or military orders. They were official papers bearing the seal of the territorial government, stamped and signed with all the formality of legal authority. "Forged military orders," Otaktay breathed, understanding flooding through him. "Morrison has not been acting under army authority. He's been operating on his own, using fake documents to justify his raids." The revelation explained everything that had puzzled Otaktay about the conspiracy. The careful secrecy, the involvement of civilian miners, the way Morrison's operations avoided official military channels, all of it made sense if the captain was conducting an unauthorized private treasure hunt while hiding behind the facade of legitimate military action. "If those papers are fake," Charlotte said, her quick mind grasping the implications, "then all the Apache he's killed, all the families he's destroyed, none of it was legal. He's been committing murder and theft, not fighting a war." But even as they absorbed this shocking truth, their situation became more desperate. Morrison's men were advancing into the canyon systematically, searching every hiding place with the thoroughness of experienced Indian fighters. Soon they would discover the hidden dwellings, and then the slaughter would begin. "We have to warn them," Charlotte said, gesturing toward the Apache families who were still going about their daily routines, unaware of the danger approaching. "We have to help them escape." "There is no escape," Otaktay replied. "Morrison has blocked the only way out. If we run, he will hunt us down one by one. If we fight, we will be outnumbered 20-1. Then what do we do?" Otaktay looked at Charlotte, this brave child who had learned Apache ways with such dedication, who had chosen honor over safety again and again, who had somehow become the daughter he thought he had lost forever. In her blue eyes, he saw not Thomas Davies' legacy of betrayal, but something entirely new. A bridge between worlds, a symbol of what might be possible if people chose courage over fear. "We make them choose," he said quietly. "Morrison's soldiers think they are following legal orders. When they learn the truth, that they have been killing innocent people for one man's greed, some of them may refuse to continue. And if they don't, then we fight," Otaktay said simply. "Not for victory, but for the chance to save even one life. Sometimes that is all a warrior can do." But Charlotte had another idea, one that drew on the knowledge she had gained from her father's documents and her weeks of travel with Otaktay. What if we could turn them against each other? Morrison and Chato both want something different. Morrison wants gold, but Chato wants revenge. If we could make them fight each other instead of us. She never finished the thought, because at that moment the first scream echoed through the canyon. Morrison's men had found the hidden community, and the final battle for the sacred valley was about to begin. But now they fought not just for their own lives, but for the truth that could expose Morrison's crimes and save the last free Apache in the territory. The forged documents Morrison carried would be the key, if they could somehow get them and reveal the deception to his own soldiers. The girl who had been abandoned to die in the desert was about to become the weapon that would bring down the man who had murdered her parents and destroyed Otaktay's family. The sacred canyon would either become a tomb for Apache culture or the place where justice finally caught up with Captain Jeremiah Morrison. The ancient Apache shield lay partially buried in the sacred cave where Otaktay's ancestors had placed it generations ago, its painted symbols still vibrant despite the passage of time. Made from thick buffalo hide stretched over a wooden frame, and adorned with eagle feathers and sacred stones, it represented the spiritual protection that had guided Apache warriors through countless battles. As Otaktay lifted it reverently from its resting place, he felt the weight of history and responsibility settle onto his shoulders. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," he told Charlotte, as thunder began to rumble overhead. The first drops of an approaching desert storm pattering against the canyon walls. He carried it when he fought the Spanish, and his father before him used it against the Mexicans. Now it falls to me to carry it against those who would destroy our sacred places. Charlotte watched as Otaktay performed the ritual preparations. His grandfather had taught him, painting traditional symbols on the shield's surface with pigments from his medicine bag. Each mark had meaning: the eagle for courage, the bear for strength, the serpent for wisdom in battle. But there were also newer symbols, ones that Otaktay added with careful deliberation. A small figure representing Charlotte, painted in white, to show her role as a bridge between worlds. "You're painting me on your shield," Charlotte said, her voice filled with wonder and fear. "Does that mean I'm going to fight too?" "You have been fighting since the day you were born," Otaktay replied. "Today you will simply fight with weapons you can see." The standoff in the sacred canyon had lasted 3 hours, with Morrison's forces controlling the entrance while the Apache families remained trapped in the hidden valley. Neither side could move without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. But the storm gathering overhead was about to change everything. Desert thunderstorms were violent and dangerous, capable of turning dry arroyos into raging torrents in minutes. From their position in the ancient cave, Charlotte and Otaktay could see the full scope of Morrison's operation. The captain had brought not just soldiers, but civilian miners equipped with explosives and heavy equipment, planning to literally tear the canyon apart in his search for treasure. Worse still, Chatto's warriors had spread out along the canyon rim, cutting off any possible escape routes for the Apache families below. "How many soldiers do you count?" Otaktay asked, testing Charlotte's observation skills one final time. Charlotte studied the canyon entrance carefully, using the tracking techniques he had taught her. 22 cavalry, 6 miners with dynamite, and Chatto has 8 warriors with him. But some of the soldiers look nervous. They keep looking at each other like they're not sure they should be here. "Good eyes," Otaktay approved. "And you are?" "Right about the soldiers. Military men are trained to follow orders, but these orders came from forged documents. If they learned the truth, they might refuse to fight," Charlotte finished. "But how do we tell them without getting shot?" Otaktay had been pondering the same question. Morrison's forged documents were the key to everything, but they were secured in a leather case that never left the captain's side. Getting close enough to steal them would require a distraction large enough to split Morrison's attention and desperate enough to make him careless. "Your father's weapon cache," Otaktay said suddenly. "In his documents from the trading post, there was mention of hidden supplies somewhere in this area." Charlotte's eyes widened as she remembered. "Papa said he kept emergency supplies hidden along all his trade routes. If there are weapons here, we could arm the Apache families." Otaktay continued, "Turn this from a massacre into a fair fight." But finding the cache would mean leaving the relative safety of the cave and venturing into the open canyon where Morrison's sharpshooters could pick them off easily. The storm, however, was providing them with cover. Lightning was beginning to flash more frequently, and the wind was picking up, making long-range shooting nearly impossible. "I know where Papa would have hidden supplies," Charlotte said quietly. He always chose places near water but above flood level, with multiple escape routes. There's a ledge about halfway up the north wall. I saw it when we first entered the canyon. Otaktay studied the ledge she indicated. It was accessible but dangerous, requiring them to cross exposed ground while Morrison's men were watching. But the approaching storm was creating a perfect opportunity. In about 10 minutes, the full fury of the desert tempest would hit, giving them the cover they needed. We go when the lightning gets closer, he decided. But Charlotte, once we leave this cave, there is no turning back. If we are caught, Morrison will not show mercy. I know, Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. But those families down there, they helped us when we needed help. Now it's our turn to help them. As if summoned by their conversation, voices began to drift up from the canyon floor. Morrison was addressing his men, his cultured accent carrying clearly in the still air before the storm. Gentlemen, we have reached the culmination of months of careful planning. The archaeological treasures contained in this canyon will make us all wealthy beyond imagination. Remember, any Apache who resists is to be considered a hostile combatant. We have full authority to use whatever force is necessary. But one of the soldiers, a young corporal with doubt written across his face, raised his hand. Sir, with respect, shouldn't we wait for official confirmation from Territorial Command? This operation wasn't in any of our regular briefings. Morrison's response was swift and harsh. Corporal Jenkins, you are questioning direct orders from Territorial Command. That borders on insubordination. Do your duty or face court-martial. The exchange confirmed what Otaktay had suspected. Most of Morrison's men believed they were following legitimate military orders. They had no idea their captain was conducting an unauthorized treasure hunt using forged documents. Those soldiers think they're doing the right thing, Charlotte whispered. If we could show them the truth. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The storm was intensifying rapidly, as desert storms always did. Soon the canyon would be filled with the sound of wind and rain, providing perfect cover for movement. But as they prepared to leave the cave, Chato's voice echoed from the canyon rim, speaking in Apache to his assembled warriors. Otaktay's face darkened as he translated the war chief's words. He is telling his men that any Apache who surrenders will be killed anyway, Otaktay said grimly. He has promised Morrison that no witnesses will be left alive to report what happens here. Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. He's going to kill everyone, even the children? Chato believes that preserving Apache honor requires eliminating all evidence of cooperation with white soldiers, Otaktay explained. In his mind, the families in this canyon are traitors who deserve death for helping us. The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer. They faced not just Morrison's greed, but Chato's twisted sense of honor. Not just military force, but Apache warriors who saw them as enemies of their own people. The storm that was about to provide cover would also make the fighting more chaotic and dangerous for everyone involved. Nasha, Charlotte said quietly, using the Apache word for guardian that had become her name for him. When this is over, if we survive, will your people accept me? Will they let me stay with you? The question struck Otaktay with unexpected force. In all their planning and preparation, he had not considered what would happen if they actually succeeded in stopping Morrison. Charlotte could not return to the white world. She knew too much about Apache sacred places and had too many enemies among corrupt officials. But Apache society had no place for white children, especially the daughter of a man who had betrayed. Apache trust? I do not know, he admitted honestly. But I know this: you have proven yourself worthy of Apache respect. You have chosen honor over safety, courage over fear. Whatever happens, you will always be my daughter, in all the ways that matter. Lightning struck close by, the thunder following instantly. The storm was directly overhead now, and visibility was dropping rapidly as wind-driven rain began to fill the canyon. It was time to move. Otaktay shouldered the ancient shield and checked his weapons one final time. Charlotte secured her father's locket around her neck and made sure the documents they had recovered were safely protected from the rain. Together, they prepared to leave the safety of the cave and venture into the chaos of the storm-lashed canyon. "Remember," Otaktay said as they reached the cave entrance, "we are not trying to win a battle. We are trying to reveal the truth. If Morrison's own soldiers turn against him, we might save everyone without more killing. And if they don't turn against him," Otaktay's grip tightened on his grandfather's war club, "then we make our stand with the shield of our ancestors and the courage of our choices. Sometimes that is all warriors can do." The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the canyon floor into a maze of puddles and streams. Somewhere in the chaos below, Apache families huddled in their hiding places while Morrison's men took positions for what they believed would be a routine military operation. None of them knew that two figures were about to emerge from the ancient cave system, carrying with them the power to expose decades of corruption and prevent a massacre. Charlotte Davies, daughter of a traitor and student of Apache ways, was about to discover whether 7 years of life could produce enough courage to challenge grown men with guns. And Otaktay, last guardian of sacred places, was about to learn whether the spirits of his ancestors would grant him the strength to protect both his adopted daughter and his people's most precious refuge. The storm had arrived, and with it, the moment when all debts would be paid and all choices would be tested in the crucible of action. The signal mirror caught the lightning flash and threw it back like a weapon, the reflected light blazing across the rain-soaked canyon with the intensity of captured starfire. Charlotte held the cavalry signal mirror steady despite the wind and rain, using the techniques Otaktay had taught her to create, the blinding flashes that would confuse both horses and riders in the crucial moments before the battle began. From their position on the narrow ledge where her father's weapon cache lay hidden, Charlotte could see the full scope of the confrontation unfolding below. Morrison's cavalry horses reared and plunged as the mirror flashes struck their eyes, their riders fighting to maintain control while trying to locate the source of the blinding light. Chaos erupted in the carefully organized formation as animals and men alike struggled against the desert storm and the unexpected assault on their vision. Otaktay used the confusion to devastating effect. Moving like a shadow despite his burden of ancient weapons, he struck at the edges of Morrison's force with surgical precision. His grandfather's war club, carved from ironwood and weighted with sacred stones, crushed the skull of the first soldier before the man could even draw his weapon. The second fell to a thrown knife that found the gap between his ribs with the accuracy born of decades of hunting and warfare. But these were veteran cavalry soldiers, men who had fought Apache warriors before and knew how to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. After the initial shock, they began to respond with disciplined precision, forming defensive positions and calling out locations to coordinate their counterattack. There, on the north ledge, girl with a mirror. Rifle fire cracked through the storm as Morrison's sharpshooters found their range. Bullets sparked off the rocks around Charlotte's position, forcing her to duck behind the cache of weapons her father had hidden years earlier. The wooden crates contained exactly what Otaktay had hoped for, repeating rifles, ammunition, and enough firepower to arm every adult Apache in the hidden valley. "Charlotte," Otaktay's voice reached her through the wind and rain. "The rifles, get them to the families." But between Charlotte and the Apache hiding places lay 50 yards of open ground, swept by cavalry fire. Moving those weapons would require either incredible luck or an even bigger distraction than the mirror flashes had provided. The distraction came from an unexpected source. Private Jenkins, the young soldier who had questioned Morrison's orders earlier, was beginning to understand that something was seriously wrong with their mission when he saw Captain Morrison draw his sidearm and take deliberate aim at a 7-year-old girl. Something inside him snapped. "Captain!" Jenkins shouted over the storm. "You're targeting a child. This isn't a military operation. This is murder." Morrison's response was swift and brutal. Without taking his eyes off Charlotte's position, he fired a single shot that dropped Private Jenkins into the mud with a bullet through his chest. The message to his remaining men was clear. Anyone who questioned orders would share the same fate. But the casual execution of their own comrade accomplished what all of Otaktay's attacks had not. Several of Morrison's soldiers lowered their weapons and stared at their captain in shock and horror. These were men who had signed up to fight Apache warriors, not to murder children and execute fellow soldiers who asked inconvenient questions. "Captain." "Morrison," Sergeant O'Brien called out, his Irish accent thick with disgust. "By what authority do you shoot down our own men?" Morrison wheeled his horse to face the sergeant, rain streaming from his uniform as lightning illuminated his face with stark, dramatic shadows. In that moment, stripped of pretense by the storm and the chaos of battle, his true nature was finally visible to his own soldiers. "By the authority of territorial command," Morrison snarled. "By the authority of military necessity, and by the authority of any officer who refuses to let subordinates interfere with critical operations." "Show us the orders," O'Brien demanded. "Show us the actual documents that authorize this operation." Morrison's hand moved toward the leather case containing his forged papers, but he never reached it. Otaktay exploded from the rocks like an avenging spirit, the ancient Apache shield deflecting the captain's desperate shot as 200 pounds of warrior muscle slammed into horse and rider. The impact sent all three, man, horse, and Apache, tumbling into the muddy canyon floor in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Morrison's leather case flew open as he hit the ground, spilling its contents into the rain-soaked sand. But instead of official military orders, what scattered across the ground were handwritten documents with forged seals, crude imitations of territorial authority that wouldn't have fooled a careful examination. Sergeant O'Brien reached the papers first, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing the deception. "These are fake," he announced to his men. "Every damn document is a forgery. We've been following the orders of a madman." The revelation rippled through Morrison's remaining soldiers like lightning, sparking a transformation that changed the entire nature of the conflict. Men who had been fighting for duty and country suddenly realized they had been manipulated into participating in mass murder for one man's greed. But the battle was far from over. Even as Morrison's own soldiers turned against him, Chatto's warriors were descending from the canyon rim, determined to eliminate every witness to the night's events. The sacred spring bubbled up from deep within the earth, its crystal-clear water untouched by the chaos raging outside the hidden cave chamber. Charlotte had found the narrow passage that led to this secret place, while fleeing Morrison's increasingly desperate pursuit. But now she was trapped here with nowhere left to run. The sound of the captain's boots echoed from the tunnel entrance as he followed her into the heart of the sacred canyon's mysteries. "End of the road, little girl," Morrison called, his voice distorted by the cave acoustics. "You've led me quite a chase, but it's over now. Give me that map, and I might let you live long enough to watch me become the richest man in the territory." Charlotte pressed herself against the cave wall beside the spring, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Morrison would hear it. In her hands, she clutched the original map from her father's locket, the document that had cost so many lives and driven so much betrayal. But as she looked at it now, illuminated by the strange phosphorescent glow that emanated from the spring itself, she finally understood what her father had truly drawn. The map wasn't marking the location of Spanish treasure at all. It was a detailed diagram of the sacred spring and the cave system that surrounded it, a place so holy to the Apache that even her father, for all his moral failings, had recognized its spiritual significance. The notations around the edges weren't directions to gold deposits, but descriptions of ceremonies and rituals that had been performed here for generations. Papa knew, she whispered to herself. He knew this wasn't about treasure. Morrison appeared at the cave entrance, his uniform torn and muddy from his desperate pursuit through the collapsing tunnel system. Rain dripped from his hair, and his eyes held the manic gleam of a man who had lost everything and was determined to salvage something from the wreckage of his schemes. "Did you say something about treasure?" he demanded, raising his service revolver. "Because I've killed too many people and ruined too many lives to walk away empty-handed now." "The treasure isn't gold," Charlotte said quietly, her young voice carrying a strange authority in the sacred space. "It never was. Papa drew this map to show the soldiers where the holy place was, but he marked it wrong on purpose. He was trying to protect it." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Your father was a fool who thought he could outsmart me. Just like you're a fool if you think I'll believe that story. Now hand over that map before I lose what's left of my patience." But Charlotte had made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of handing Morrison the map, she tore it into pieces and threw them into the sacred spring. The ancient paper dissolved instantly in the pure water, taking with it the last physical evidence of the canyon's location. "You little—" Morrison started forward, rage overtaking calculation, but his words were cut off by the sound of falling rocks. The cave entrance was collapsing, triggered by the explosions and gunfire that had shaken the entire canyon system throughout the night. Heavy stones crashed down, sealing the tunnel and trapping both Charlotte and Morrison in the chamber with the sacred spring. But the cave-in did more than imprison them. It cut off Morrison's escape route and left him facing the consequences of his choices with nowhere left to run. "Look what you've done," Morrison snarled, turning his weapon toward Charlotte. "You've killed us both for the sake of protecting savages who would scalp you without a second thought." "No," said a familiar voice from the shadows. "She has chosen to protect people who became her family when no one else would." Otaktay emerged from a hidden passage Charlotte hadn't even noticed, moving with the fluid grace of a man who belonged in sacred places. His face bore fresh wounds from the battle outside, but his eyes burned with the focused intensity of a warrior who had found his true purpose. Morrison spun toward this new threat, but his reactions were slowed by exhaustion and desperation. Otaktay's attack was swift and decisive, not the wild fury of revenge, but the precise application of force by a man who understood the difference between justice and murder. The captain's weapon flew from his hands as Otaktay's war club connected with his wrist. Morrison fell heavily beside the sacred spring, his uniform soaking in the pure water that had flowed here since long before white men ever set foot in Apache territory. "It's over," Otaktay said simply. "Your soldiers have surrendered." To Sergeant O'Brien, who is an honorable man. "Chateau died asking my forgiveness for his betrayal. The Apache families are safe, and the truth about your forged orders will reach territorial command within days." Morrison struggled to sit up, cradling his broken wrist. "You think this changes anything? There will be others like me. There will always be men who see opportunity where you see sacred ground." "Perhaps," Otaktay agreed, "but they will not have the map, and they will not have the cooperation of good soldiers who believed. They were following legal orders. Most importantly, they will not have the element of surprise. The Apache know now what to watch for." Charlotte approached the sacred spring and knelt beside it, placing her hands in the pure water that bubbled up from the earth's depths. As she did, she felt a strange sense of completion, as if the journey that had begun with her abandonment in the desert was finally reaching its proper conclusion. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at Otaktay. "Now," he said, helping her to her feet, "we find a way out of this cave and begin the work of building something better than what came before." 3 months after the storm that changed everything, Charlotte Davies stood in the afternoon sun of the hidden valley, watching Apache children play in the stream while their parents tended gardens that would soon yield the season's harvest. The official adoption papers, signed by both the territorial governor and the commanding officer of Fort Apache, lay safely tucked in Otaktay's medicine bag, legal recognition of what had already become true in every way that mattered. The documents represented far more than simple adoption. They were a symbol of the new understanding that had emerged from the chaos and violence of that terrible night in the sacred canyon. Colonel Bradley, the honest cavalry officer who had replaced the corrupt officials Morrison had bribed, had seen the wisdom in creating a legal framework that allowed Apache culture to survive while acknowledging territorial authority. Charlotte had learned to read and write in both English and Apache, serving as a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for so long that many people had forgotten why the fighting had started. Her small desk in the traditional dwelling she shared with Otaktay was covered with letters, correspondence with territorial officials, messages from Apache bands scattered across the southwest, and reports from the honest soldiers who now worked to prevent the kind of corruption that had cost so many lives. But it was the personal letter she was writing that meant the most to her, addressed to relatives in Missouri she had never met, but who deserved to know what had become of Thomas Davis's daughter. "Dear Uncle William," she wrote in her careful script, "I know you must have wondered what happened to us when Papa's letters stopped coming. I'm sorry to tell you that Papa and Mama died of poison, not fever, as the wagon train reported. The man who killed them also tried to kill me, but I was saved by an Apache warrior named Otaktay, who has become my adopted father." She paused in her writing, considering how to explain the transformation that had occurred in her understanding of family, honor, and home. How could she make her blood relatives understand that she had found something in the Arizona mountains that she had never experienced in Missouri? The security of being genuinely valued and protected. "I know this must sound strange to you," she continued, "but I have found a new family here among the Apache people. Otaktay has taught me skills that will keep me safe in any situation, and the community has accepted me as one of their own. I'm not the same little girl who left Missouri with Papa and Mama, but I believe I'm becoming someone they would be proud of." Through the open doorway she could see Otaktay working with the young Apache men, teaching them the traditional skills of tracking and hunting, while also showing them how to deal with the changing world beyond the canyon. At 45, he had found a new purpose in preparing the next generation for challenges he could not have imagined in his own youth. The Sacred Valley had become something unprecedented in the territory, a place where Apache culture could flourish, under official protection, where children could learn traditional ways while also acquiring the knowledge they would need to navigate the modern world. Visitors came regularly now, anthropologists who documented Apache customs with respectful attention, military officers who sought to understand the people they had previously only fought, and government officials who recognized the value of cooperation over conquest. "Captain Morrison died in prison before his trial could be completed," Charlotte wrote, "but the truth about his crimes came out anyway. Sergeant O'Brien, who is now Lieutenant O'Brien, made sure that all the documents were published in the territorial newspapers. People know now what happens when corruption replaces honor in military service." The sound of horses approaching drew Charlotte's attention to the canyon entrance, where a familiar figure was dismounting from his cavalry horse. Lieutenant O'Brien had become a regular visitor to the valley, partly for official business, but mostly because he had developed a genuine friendship with Otaktay and deep respect for what the Apache community had achieved. "Charlotte," O'Brien called as he approached the dwelling, "I have news from the territorial capital. The governor has approved the expansion of the protected area to include the entire canyon system. No mining or development will be allowed here without explicit Apache consent." It was the news they had been hoping for, final legal protection for the sacred places that had been threatened for so long. But Charlotte knew that laws were only as strong as the people who enforced them, and that lasting peace would require continued vigilance and cooperation. "There's something else," O'Brien continued, his expression growing more serious. "The War Department in Washington has requested a full report on the Apache integration program. They're considering using this valley as a model for other reservations." Across the Southwest, Charlotte felt a mixture of pride and concern. Recognition was gratifying, but it also brought attention that could threaten the delicate balance they had achieved. The Hidden Valley's success depended partly on its isolation, on being left alone to develop solutions without outside interference. "What does Otaktay think?" she asked. "He says that hiding from the world is no longer possible," O'Brien replied. "Better to shape how change happens than to let it happen without Apache voices being heard." That evening, as the sun set behind the canyon walls and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Charlotte joined Otaktay beside the stream where Apache families gathered for the evening meal. The locket around her neck now contained 3 photographs: her original parents, Thomas and Margaret Davies, and a new image of Otaktay taken by a visiting photographer who had documented the valley's unique community. "Do you ever regret staying here instead of going to your relatives in the east?" Otaktay asked, following her gaze toward the photographs. Charlotte considered the question seriously. She thought about the life she might have lived in Missouri, safe and conventional among people who shared her blood but not her experiences. Then she looked around at the Apache children who had become her playmates, the elders who had taught her traditional stories, the community that had accepted her not because she was born to them, but because she had chosen to belong. "No," she said finally, "this is where I'm supposed to be. This is my home." As darkness settled over the Hidden Valley, Charlotte heard the sound that had become the soundtrack of her new life. Apache voices singing traditional songs while children laughed and played in the stream. It was the sound of a culture that had survived centuries of change and challenge, adapted and grown stronger, and found a way to embrace the future without abandoning the past. The little girl who had been tied to a tree in the burning desert had become Charlotte Davies, daughter of 2 worlds, guardian of bridges between peoples who had thought themselves eternal enemies. And in the sacred canyon where her father's map had led so much trouble, she had finally found the treasure that mattered most, a family bound not by blood but by choice, honor, and love.